The world's industrialized economies appear to be in recovery mode. After 2% growth last year, some expect the US economy to expand by as much as 3% this year. The Japanese economy seems finally to be reviving, while in Europe, former basket cases Ireland and Portugal have returned to the debt markets. Even Greece is saying it could issue sovereign bonds this year. But there's several large clouds accompanying this silver lining. There's concerns about deflation, persistent and rising inequality, falling productivity and low labour force participation rates. The recovery since the financial crisis has been decidedly weak. Some observers say that what recovery there has been is largely due to the fuel of central bank support. Others that we are in an era of secular stagnation in which savers outweigh investors. So can the US and other industrialized economies return to their pre-crisis growth rates? Or are we witnessing a new normal of slower economic expansion? Welcome to The Big Question, the monthly video series from Capital Ideas at Chicago Booth. I'm Hal Weitzman, and with me to discuss the issue is an expert panel. Erik Hurst is the V. Duane Rath Professor of Economics and the John E. Duke Faculty Fellow at Chicago Booth. An expert on housing markets, labor markets, and household financial behavior, he's also served as an advisor to the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. He's the recipient of several awards, including most recently the Ewing Marion Kauffman Prize Medal for Distinguished Research in Entrepreneurship. Anil Kashyap is the Edward Eagle Brown Professor of Economics and Finance at Chicago Booth and a Faculty Director of the Initiative on Global Markets. He's also an advisor to the Federal Reserve, the IMF, the Congressional Budget Office and the Swedish Central Bank. And Harald Uhlig is a professor of economics and former chair of the economics department at the University of Chicago. He's an expert on, among other things, the intersection of macroeconomics and financial economics. As well as his work at the University of Chicago, he's also a guest researcher at the Bundesbank and head editor of the Journal of Political Economy. Panel, welcome to The Big Question. Erik Hurst, let me start with you. When we say secular stagnation, what does that actually mean?
Usually talk about it as an overall lack of demand in the economy. It used to be about 20, 30 years ago talking about the decline in population in the US, and when there's less people, there'd be less demand for products and firms wouldn't have to produce as much. I think people are talking about it now more in the sense that we used to talk about an old liquidity trap, that real interest rates in the economy need to be lower than they are now, and the Federal Reserve is bound by interest rates at zero, so interest rates are higher than they should be, and as a result we can't get enough jump-starting of the economy.
Okay, and Anil Kashyap, how serious a concern is secular stagnation?
Well, for the U.S., I don't think it's looking terribly good because it looks like we're finally going to start growing. If you looked at the normal patterns in a recovery, you'd say, well, we're 4 years into this recovery. It's about time for another recession. And lately, the growth has actually looked pretty good. Probably looks better this coming year than it has in any of the last 3 or 4. So I'm guessing a year from now we won't be talking about secular stagnation in the United States.
And Harald Uhlig, if we shouldn't worry about secular stagnation in the US, at least not this year, what about in Europe?
Well, Europe is not out of trouble yet. I mean, the situation in Europe looks better, but unemployment is still extremely high in Spain. You know, we're talking about above 25% youth unemployment. It's above 50%. Greece is certainly not out of trouble. So the Eurozone still looks very fragile. And it's an interesting question of how to go forward. I mean, there's a good scenario and there's a bad scenario. And I think we need to be talking about both.
Okay, well, sketch them out very briefly for us then.
Well, the good scenario is that, things work themselves out, that somehow, labor market reforms start to kick in Spain and Greece, that maybe global demand picks up, unemployment comes down, maybe the banks become healthy again, the single resolution mechanism is finally bringing peace and quiet to the financial system and everything. Maybe in 3-4 years, the crisis by largely forgotten. It's entirely possible. It's also possible that the Eurozone crisis flares up again, that investors in these government bonds think once again that maybe fiscal plans in Spain are not sustainable, that maybe there's going to be more talk again about exiting the Eurozone or breakup of the Eurozone. It could happen that the German Constitutional Court steps in and says certain policies by the ECB, particularly the OMT, are unconstitutional and that the ECB has to retrench. And, who knows? I mean, we might be back in the storm. Maybe what we are seeing is just the eye of the storm passing us by and it looks nice and quiet, but maybe a second hurricane is coming.
So there's those expectations that this was going to be the year that Eurozone got back on track. You're not convinced yet?
Not convinced. I mean, somewhat cautiously optimistic, yes. But I mean, you look at the statistics in these countries. I mean, they are, they're not in good shape, right, by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay, you mentioned employment. I want to come back to the US. Erik Hurst, you're an expert on US employment trends. What are we seeing here? What are the kind of the secular trends here in the US?
The thing I'm most worried about going forward is the very low employment to population ratio we've seen in the US. We had this big decline in the fraction of people working, and it has not rebounded at all since the recession is finished. So even though we're growing at 2 to 3% per year coming out of the recession, we have not seen large employment gains measured by the employment to population ratio. And it's kind of very, the inequality you see across people with skill and without skill shows up strongly in the employment numbers. So for workers with less than a college degree, they have seen very little gains in employment. The employment to population ratio fell and hasn't rebounded much. But for those with a college degree or more, we're kind of right back on trend where we were prior to the recession. So you see this kind of divergence going forward, and I don't see anything on the horizon that's going to tell me that's going to change if it hasn't started changing already.
So you see the kind of low participation rate in the labour force as being something that's going to be with us for a long time?
I think part of it is going to be with us for a long time.
Does that mean people who lost their jobs during the downturn may never work again?
The older ones of those might not work again. We're seeing big uptakes in the disability roles, and I think the younger workers adjust. Young generations tend to be much more elastic than older generations, but these, older workers who kind of got displaced during the recession, I think there might be periods of time where they might remain out of the labor force for a persistent period of time.
And what effect is that going to have on U.S. growth in the longer term?
I mean, again, it's related to the inequality questions that you hear people popping up and talking about going forward, that there's going to be a group of people when the economy is going to be chugging along 2-3% going forward. Some are going to get more of the gains and others are going to get less of the gains.
So to you, it's less a question about the actual number of growth and more about how it's distributed. And inequality is a kind of a global concern, right? Anil Kashyap, is that really affecting the global economy?
Well, maybe, but I mean, I think Erik didn't say anything that I disagree with, but the usual debate over inequality is smearing together very different things. There's some people that are ranting about the top 1%. And that's got to do with globalization, and there's lots of reasons why the most talented people in all industries are making more money now than they ever have before. That's completely separate from all the problems that happen if you're unmarried and have a kid without graduating from high school. I think those are really rather different problems, but those are the two extremes. And then in the middle, you've got somewhat different dynamics going on as well. And so this question about how the overall strength of the economy plays into these three different groups, I think, is very different.
But there is a question, isn't there, about the middle class, particularly in industrialized countries, and the kind of stagnation in incomes in the middle class.
Yeah, although, there was some very recent work that was released just last week by Raj Chetty and Emmanuel Saez that got the most comprehensive look anybody's had at actual mobility, including for the middle class. And those numbers kind of suggested that if you were just looking at the broadest trends, at least between the people coming into the workforce in the early 1970s and then all the way into the late 1980s, outcomes look pretty similar. Now, maybe you aren't happy with the overall amount of mobility, but the narrative that it's impossible to get into the middle class or to get from the middle class into the upper classes just doesn't look like it's in the data.
Related to that, there's a lot of work showing about a hollowing out of the skill distribution in the U.S. That jobs that we used to do, we just don't do as much anymore. Some people call them routine jobs. You could say manufacturing jobs is a big piece of these routine jobs. And those jobs are just less prevalent than they were before, and people would associate some of these jobs as being part of middle class jobs. And you've seen that missing part of the skill distribution. So you have people, bartenders are doing relatively well. You have, college professors doing relatively well. But there's kind of in the middle, there seems to be a missing mass of workers. And I think that's the kind of thing that I've been thinking about in my own work related. David Autor at MIT has some stuff kind of showing about this decline in routine jobs in the U.S., whatever you call it, manufacturing routine, and how that's had effects on certain skill groups more than others. And I think I don't see any way to get around some of those issues.
Harald Uhlig?
I believe that inequality is actually an important ingredient for strong growth. You see, if there are jobs out there that pay, millions, tens of millions of money, that ignites dreams in people, right? It ignites dreams in young people, and that's what we want. We want young people to dream. We want them to dream that they can change the world, that they can make it big, that they go after, creating a new company, maybe creating new movies, creating new songs, creating that new product that Wall Street sells to the world, right? It's these dreams that power people in becoming, creative and entrepreneur and going out there and trying stuff, even if they fail, right? I mean, people routinely overestimate how successful they can be, right? Everybody plays on his piano and thinks he's going to be the next pop star, but if lots of people are trying, if you make it big time, and that's what drives that industry. If you look at China, right, there are lots and lots of people are dreaming, right? China has permitted more of a market economy now. There's quite a middle class in China, and they want their children to be, the world movers of the future. They send them to the best universities and so forth. They want them to be successful. So China has discovered inequality, and I think we should cherish inequality in America.
Really? So you think inequality is actually a powerful force for growth?
Absolutely, yes.
Erik Hurst?
You always want to have people have the right incentives to kind of innovate or invest in some sort of productive capacity. The thing that people kind of fixate a little bit more now when they're talking about inequality, at least the way I've been thinking about inequality, is whether people have the skills to do some of those tasks that has the high rewards. So is there a matching between the skill composition of the workforce and the skills which are needed to get some of those high returns? So you want both. You want to have high returns to encourage innovation, but you also want the composition of the workforce to be able to have the skills to innovate. And I think that's kind of where we're seeing some of the mismatch today. The top of the distribution, I mean, when I say top, it doesn't mean 1% or so. We're doing quite well. People are innovating and coming up with products, but you're seeing a tremendous amount of sluggishness, at least in employment, for people with high school degrees or less, or even a little bit of some college, but not a college degree.
Anil Kashyap, let me ask you about monetary policy. How important are central banks to the growth, the kind of fledgling growth that we've seen last year and this year so far?
Well, I think they're reaching the limits of what they can do. I mean, we're 5 years past the recession. Most theories would say at some point the monetary effects start to die out, and that the supply side of the economy becomes more important. The longer the horizon, by the time you're talking 10, 15 years, nobody thinks monetary policy can stimulate an economy for that long. So we're halfway there, and I think we're seeing some of these economies are kind of slumping back into the same bad situation that they had a year or two before the crisis. If you look at one indicator is the IMF's assessment of what countries needed to do to grow. And one thing that's very disheartening is if you took what the IMF was saying to Italy, France, Spain in 2003 and look at what they're telling them in 2013, it's the same, cut and paste. And so that's pretty discouraging because the challenges are much harder now to implement the reforms that they wouldn't do when the sun was shining.
What do you make of Japan? Because you're an expert on Japan. It seems there that loose monetary policy is having some effect and helping.
Yeah, but it's mostly just affecting inflation. They're about to raise taxes in Japan. We'll see how the economy does after that. But the famous third arrow isn't even out of the quiver. I mean, it looks like the third arrow is a bluff.
You're talking about structural reforms.
Yeah, so Mr. Abe said we need massive fiscal stimulus, we need loose monetary policy, and then we need structural reform. So he's done the fiscal stimulus, he's done a little bit of and he's done the monetary policy now, but the big, rewards will come from reforming the economy and kind of shaking them out of the malaise, making it easier to create businesses, creating easier times to hire workers and for people to get training and so on. And that's just stagnated, nothing.
Harald Uhlig, is that a similar problem in Europe? Is it the failure actually to put in place the reforms that's the Achilles heel there?
I think Spain and Greece and Italy, they had it so good for so many years that there was little necessity to do much. And housing market boomed and people were buying properties. I mean, you look at Barcelona now and compared to how it looked 20 years ago. I mean, what a change, right? And what a city, right? And so they had a big party, and I don't blame them, right? Things were good, and the party has come to an end, and now they have to get out of this. I mean, if you look at competitive numbers for Italy, for example, where I looked, looks like Italian wages are 20% too high. So something has to happen on the labor market there. But it seems to me they are still, they're having great difficulties even making a start on this. And there's big disagreement among the parties, and they still think they can shift the problem elsewhere. So I think they will probably carry these problems forward for quite some time.
Erik, Hurst?
Yeah, so one of the things we usually think that Harald referred to earlier is having a flexible enough economy so people with the innovations, their skills as a pop star or their skills as a banker could translate that easily. And you want it both on the worker side and the firm side. And I think one way that the U.S. is in a better shape than Europe on this is that the labor market is pretty flexible. There's not a lot of cost to hiring, there's not a lot of cost to firing, and that makes us a little bit more flexible relative to Europe. The thing we could be concerned about is making sure we don't go down a path in the U.S. where you have some of this inequality, and you want to treat the inequality, if to the extent that it's there, in a way that doesn't discourage people's ability to work.
Harald Uhlig?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent, really important point. And I mean, if you think about Europe again, right? Germany, for example, always looked to the U.S. labor market and said, how can we bring unemployment down? Unemployment was persistently high in Germany. Germany was considered the sick man of Europe. And so they looked to the U.S. experience, they looked to the Danish experiments and reformed the labor market, right? The Schröder government reformed the labor market. It was a big reform. It was a very painful reform, right? The Social Democrats lost the elections over that. They broke up as a party. Politically, it was enormously costly. But Germany is now, bearing the fruits of that reform, right? Germany is doing well, I would say, within Europe. And in some of these other countries, right, because there was much less of a need, didn't introduce the flexibility. So hopefully, many of these other countries learn, and they have to go through painful labor market reforms. I think there's no way around it, and getting more of that flexibility that the U.S. has.
Anil Kashyap?
Yeah, well, I totally agree that the Schröder reforms were vastly underestimated at the time as to how well they set the stage for German growth over the last 6-7 years. And Germany sticks out. It's growing. It's recovered to where it was before the crisis. There's a lot of momentum there, optimism and all that. And I think when Mrs. Merkel talks about what she means by austerity, she means doing the hard things, having the hard conversations, making people be accountable and so on in a way that the Germans actually did. Now, the side to that was the Germans had a lot of fiscal stimulus at the time they were doing it. So they blew through the budget deficit thresholds that they were supposed to avoid. And I think that was a good trade. And I would hope that the Germans at this point would say to Italy and Spain, if you actually do reform, we'll let you off the hook on what your budget deficits might look like during the short period while you're enacting reforms.
What are some of the policies that might work in terms of global growth? I mean, structural reforms is one. What are some of the other things that governments could do that might help some of these problems that you've raised?
Well, the structural reforms is kind of like the catch-all for everything, but things that make it easier to form businesses, things that make it easier to grow a business. In a lot of these countries, they have size-based regulation where you get to 20 workers or 50 workers, you're subject to a whole host of rules. So guess what? No one wants to grow. But we know small firms are massively less efficient than larger firms. And so collecting taxes on a more reasonable way so that you can't evade taxes by staying small, and have more equitable tax rates because you collect from everybody.
Okay, and Erik, Hurst, you talked about the labor market in the U.S. and inequality in the U.S. What would you like to see done to address those concerns?
The big issue, I think, with the U.S. is that the labor market is very flexible on most of these. The thing is, there's a skill mismatch for where the jobs we've been moving to and some of the skills the workers have to fill those jobs. And how you promote human capital among a population, particularly when there's already a return to skill that's pretty big. You could get a lot of return from, going to college or trying to be a pop star. And if people aren't responding to those, how do you do it? That's above my pay grade. But I know many of my colleagues, our colleague Jim Heckman over in the economics department thinks hard about how you promote human capital, even within the US. And not a lot of levers have big payoffs at this time that people have stumbled across.
It's partly also because it's a big social problem. If you look at the bottom end of the labor distribution, the labor market outcomes and income distribution, they have 4 or 5 pathologies that are all gone wrong. I mean, you don't have 2 parents in homes. You have people that are undereducated. You have people that don't have consistent work histories. They probably don't have good medical care. Maybe that's going to get finally fixed. They're like one shock away from having their lives unravel, and it's not going to be something simple to turn that around.
One program that I do think we need to revisit at some point is the disability program in the United States. I mean, there's been a lot of evidence over the last 15 years or so that it is a margin of substitution when labor markets get weak. And the thing about the disability program relative to other, labor market subsidy programs, we have the unemployment insurance, it tends to be permanent. Very few people ever exit from disability back into work. And to the extent that people are using it as a marginal, insurance for, business cycle variation, I think we might need to think about, ways to strengthen that.
Yeah, my good colleague Casey Mulligan over in the economics department claims that all the various programs and added taxes and extending unemployment benefits and so forth, have maybe contributed half of what we see in terms of the unemployment numbers, right? Has doubled the severity of the crisis. No one maybe can quibble with the numbers, and there's been a bit debate about this, but
Are there just too many incentives not to work?
Exactly, and I think we ought to take a harder look at these and not just say we got to help these people, so let's do one program after the other. Oh, now the crisis is even deeper. Now let's do another program. But rather maybe retrench and really think hard whether these programs are really helping the people where they need it. I mean, these are, as Erik described, these are people that are fallen on hard times, but it's not the government that's going to create jobs for them. It's the private market that creates jobs for them. So we have to make sure that the private market does that and does that soon.
Yeah, Casey's numbers might be on the high side, but it's the direction goes the right way in the sense that, when you create incentives to work, people work. When you create incentives that not to work, people don't work. So we know the direction, and I think some of these programs are more salient than others. But we want to promote an environment of work, and to the extent that we think, as a society, that some distribution needs to be done to help mitigate it, we want to do it in a way that doesn't discourage re-entry into the labor force or re-accumulation of skills to match the jobs that are out there.
Okay. Going back to the global economy, Anil Kashyap, the IMF and others have fretted publicly about the threat of deflation. How serious is that a concern?
Well, it depends where. I don't think we're headed towards deflation in the U.S. Very low inflation, I think, is going to be present in many of these countries. I don't think anyone expects Japan to have inflation above 2% for the next few years, even though they're trying very hard now. If you asked me what's the risk over 8 or 10 years, it's that they don't do the reforms and they wake up one day and they can't borrow and the only thing you can do is print money. So I still think a good old-fashioned currency crisis is a possibility if they don't start doing things to facilitate growth. So I'm not so worried about deflation right now, but I am worried that if there isn't growth, something's going to have to give.
Okay. And deflation in Europe?
Well, we are still having inflation rather than deflation in Europe, even though it's very, very modest. I think it's lower than where the European Central Bank wants it to be. I think what we're looking at is an entirely new phenomenon, right? Inflation really used to be an evil, and central banks had a hard time, getting that into check. And then over the last, 20 years or so, central banks actually managed to control inflation to a remarkable degree and get it down to the 1 to 2% range. Really precisely controlling it, which is remarkable. And, there were a lot of voices from the academic community that said, let's bring inflation down. Maybe some slight deflation is even a good thing, right? You can make that argument. And now that we have it so low, occasionally we're going to hit those constraints. Occasionally we're going to see zero nominal interest rates, and occasionally you're going to see some deflation. The question is it bad? and they are much more skeptical than Larry Summers or other people. So, just as one example, I'm doing research with Chiara Frato, who was a graduate student here at our department, taking a medium-scale new Keynesian model and wanted to know how much the fact that the central bank hits that zero lower bound, how much that has contributed to the crisis. Then we found it's a very small fraction. I mean, it's true it would have been nice if they could have gone somewhat lower, but that's not explaining why we are in such a deep recession.
The thing that Neil mentioned, I think kind of slipped in there that's important is that a lot of the, inflationary periods we've seen in recent times when central banks have gotten good at managing inflation have come from big fiscal burdens on the economy, a promise to pay a certain group and not a lot of tax revenues come in, so there's the temptation to run the printing presses. And I think, when you're talking about the structural reforms and potential inflation going forward, the structural reforms of trying to manage with a aging population and low fertility rates could put this kind of pressure on modern economies. And that, I think, is the risk of inflation going forward, is these kind of fiscal imbalances within the government.
Anil Kashyap, the US used to carry the global economy. US consumer was kind of the engine of the global economy. This year, it may be that the US is, emerging markets have slowed down considerably. It may be that the US is the only economy to start growing again in earnest. Can it carry the global economy the way it used to?
I don't know. I'm not sure that anybody in the U.S. should care. I mean, I think we should run good policy for what's happening here, paying a little bit of attention to the world, but largely we should try to get our own house in order. I mean, we've got these aging problems that Erik talked about that are eventually going to have to be attended to. It'd be nice to get something in place on that front, but I think, this year does look relatively good for the U.S., and assuming there isn't a crisis in Europe or some huge crisis out of the Middle East or somewhere else, I think the outlook here is pretty good. So I see more risk to the upside of growth in the U.S. than the downside. That's the first time I think you could say that since before the crisis.
Is the Eurozone still the kind of the potential danger here for the global economy?
I guess that's one of them. Certainly the Middle East I still think is one crazy dictator away from creating chaos. So I think you can't take that off the table. And then if there was a real big collapse in emerging markets, it would be bad for the U.S. But I think Europe is the biggest risk, largely because there doesn't seem to be a plan B in Europe. I mean, if you look back in Europe for the last 3 years, it's always, then the German election will come. Now it's the asset quality review of the banking system. After that happens and nothing changes, they'll invent some other thing to look forward to. And the answer is staring them right in the face. They've got to do the stuff that the IMF's been telling them to do for 10 years and that Harald's been writing about. Everybody looks at Europe and says, you guys have huge government sectors, you have very weak incentives to hire people, to grow. You got to fix that. Germany did, it grows, but we explain that away some other way. We just want to, look. And some of the countries are going backwards. France has been going backwards for the last 2 years. So we're not even talking fighting to a draw. It's actually getting worse.
Is there a danger that if you get growth, even modest growth, actually it has a downside, which is you never bother attending to these reforms, either in the US or in the Eurozone?
I mean, there's always an incentive to push hard things off to the future when, maybe, the way I like to say it, structural reforms might not be needed if you get big positive productivity draws for many, many periods in a row. So people hope that it's easier to kick the can down, and there's some part of distribution which says maybe if you kind of kick it down and you get lucky, then you don't need to do the big structural reforms. But in practice, you always do. And those periods of successive periods of growth don't come. And so it's easier to adjust with these things earlier rather than later. You get smaller change early, bigger change later. So the more you kick the can down the road, the more disruptive adjustments need to take place.
And actually productivity is an issue we haven't talked about, but there was dramatic fall in productivity for the first time last year, according to a recent report. Harald Uhlig, should we expect any kind of significant move forward from the Eurozone this year?
On productivity.
Or any of these reforms we've been talking about, things you think are so necessary?
Yeah, I mean, I think the countries gradually come to grips with the situation. You know, I mean, in Spain, I think I'm a bit more hopeful than in Italy, frankly. But I mean, who knows? I mean, it's as Anil pointed out, in France, things have been going backwards for a while, right? And Hollande started out, you know, trying to implement tax rates of, I don't know, 70%, as some of our colleagues elsewhere have urged him to do, actually. And now he's retreating from this. So I think even in France, it slowly dawns on them that maybe a business-unfriendly policy is not the way to go. But whether we see much of a contribution to world economic growth from Europe, I think that would be a stretch.
Okay. Well, on that note, I'm going to wind things up. My thanks to our panel, Erik, Hurst, Anil Kashyap, and Harald Uhlig. For more research, analysis, and commentary, visit us online at chicagobooth.edu/capideas. Join us again next time for another Big Question. Goodbye.